morning, everybody. I hope you are well. Thank you, Mr. Governor, Dr. Mario Vella, for inviting me to give this talk about the Maltese experience of the 1919 influenza pandemic. This lecture is based on a study I made with two colleagues of mine, Professor Larry Suchuk and Dr. Leanne Tripp from the University of Toronto and the University of West British Columbia, respectively. In our talk, we are going to deal with the 1918 influenza pandemic and see why it was unique. The influenza pandemic of 1918 is more popularly known as the Spanish flu. It's called the Spanish flu because it didn't begin in Spain, but since during the First World War, Spain was a neutral country, it had no problems to declare that it has an influenza pandemic. That's why it's called Spanish flu. We will see the historical background of Malta during the Great War and what preventive measures were taken to mitigate, slow spread of the virus, what resources we used, and what were the disease experience between Malta and Gozo. We are keeping Malta as the benchmark for our study, but there were certain particular differences. A new concept which we discovered in our study is that children were introducers of the virus to the family. And there were gender differences in the influenza illness and death. The pandemic flu also had some birth consequences. And another aspect which was never studied was the transportation system, mainly the train system, which also affected the spread of the influenza. On a macro level, we can say that the flu pandemic started in June 1918 and lasted up to May 1919, affecting around 20,000 Maltese, including Gozo, and probably the actual numbers were much greater, an estimated 50,000. This is because many cases were mild and there was a lot of underreporting. We also know that about 1,000 Maltese died from the flu and its complications. But on the whole, relatively, Malta was spared from the influenza. It didn't have much morbidity and mortality as in other places. So the origin of the virus was in America, in a county, Pasco County, Kansas, USA, and in this region it started flourishing by the thousands. As all you know now, the flu spreads mainly by droplet infection, where when we sneeze, cough, talk, we spread these droplets, which contain the virus, and infect other persons. We can also spread the infection by means of fomites, which means if we vomit near or on somebody else. Other means of transport are when there is close contact between people. So it depends on the number of persons in a household, the number of rooms and the size of the room in a house, and crowding, both in households and crowding in outer space. And also the types of rooms there are, the ventilation. We know that the influenza pandemic had a significant historical significance because it affected mainly, although it involved all countries around the world, 25% of cases were in America. And this rate was also observed in military stations in Malta. So it had to do with the armies, both abroad and also in Malta. Because we believe, as we will see later, it was introduced in Malta by means of the Navy. The influenza pandemic had an extremely high mortality rate. There were age differences, and this particular type of influenza had a Y-shaped signature, which means that unlike other influenza pandemics, it killed young and old at higher rates. But there is a group, the middle-aged persons, who also died. Usually influenza kills the young and the old. But in the center of the Y shape, there is also another increase in mortality and morbidity. Another phenomenon which we learned later on was that influenza viruses can be transmitted from animals to humans, and the closest this has been to in the avian strains and the swine strains, which we got later on, and we will be talking about them later on. The Spanish flu had a high mortality rate, and initially from the studies we could pick up, there was a wide range of people who were supposed to be killed from the Spanish flu. Such a range between 17 and 100 million, which is a very big range. From more recent studies, we are getting to know that the numbers actually were less in total of people killed from the Spanish influenza. And later versions of influenza killed less people, in the range of 1 million or 2 million, not in that great number as Spanish flu did, although the numbers were as not great as being quoted in this particular study. So let's have a look at other flu pandemics. The H1N1 is the Spanish flu of 1818, 1819. And before that, 28 years before, 1889, 1890, there was another outbreak, a pandemic, which was called the Russian flu. And this actually started in Russia, spread to America, Canada, and later to the Western world. And this pandemic was, now we have theories which we believe was the reason why it affected how the Spanish flu later on affected the world. In the influenza of the Russian flu, they thought, we think nowadays that it was a influenza type A, the subtype was H3, and we don't know exactly whether it was N2 or N3. So we are here, it is more likely similar to the Hong Kong flu or the avian flu. And but we don't know exactly what subtype it was. But there is always some form of immunity if you are exposed to it. Other flus we got later on were the swine flu and of course the avian flu later on, where we started to get vaccines against them and also antivirals. But sometimes the antivirals were used in excessive amounts, and tolerance and resistance built up to these drugs, and they were not effective anymore. Human viruses are very common. They are around us in the air, and they live on particles, on living particles. Okay, they cannot live on inanimate objects, but they have to be a living object. It could be a tree, be an animal, or it could be a human being. And we know that there are about 219 known viruses. The yellow fever virus was the first virus discovered in 1901. And viruses originate mainly from mammals and birds. And as we improve in our technology in studying these viruses, we find more viruses every day. In fact, after 1950s, we are discovering about 3 to 4 new species of viruses every year. And sometimes we come up with novel viruses. The influenza virus 1819 was a novel virus for that time, 100 years ago. The coronavirus nowadays is also a novel virus for these days. And so the emergence of these new human viruses is a biological and ecological process which we have to keep an eye and act immediately to prevent the spread. We cannot stop them, we have to keep an eye, and every number of years, say 10, 20 years, we get a bout of some sort of serious virus, which could be a completely novel virus, as we are experiencing at this present time. This is the Y-shaped age mortality curve of influenza. So, as you see, it doesn't affect mainly the young and the old, but also a bracket of middle-aged people. And in our case, the female reproductive age between 15 and between 20 and 35 were mostly affected. There were more females affected than males. And in Malta, 51% of men aged 25 to 49 years died of influenza, and 55% of Maltese women aged 15 to 35, that's the reproductive age of a woman, 15 to 35 years, died of influenza. And so it gives you the Y signature, the Y-shaped signature of this pandemic. The concept of animal to human transmission was very interesting because the influenza, the virus, could move because of a mutation from a bird to a pig, and then from the pig to a human, and back, or from a bird to a human directly, and from man back to an animal, which in this case is pig. Then we had the swine flu. And so a human being can infect an animal, in this case a pig, and also a pig can infect man. And pigs suffer from influenza, from swine flu, and they get also symptoms similar to humans. When we were dealing with the swine flu pandemic, we used a lot of antiviral drugs, and because of overuse, resistance developed against these antivirals, and they were not effective anymore. The general background found in Malta in 1819, just at the end of the First War, was that we had a war. And the war put Malta in intimate and continuous contact with various people around the world. And Malta was a strategic British colony, and it served the needs of the British colonial empire. Highly dependent on serving the naval dockyard, as well as needs to the officials and military stationed in the islands of Malta. Initially, Malta prospered with the beginning of the war, initially, because new employment, new movements, many ships, naval ships, many naval officers, British officers in Malta, requiring where to stay, requiring where to eat, other needs, and the main employment in Malta was evolving around the needs of the British in Malta. But later on, in 1917, 1918, the effect of the war was a negative one. Price of objects was very high. Bread and was very expensive because wheat and flour were difficult to obtain, and they were very expensive. The 1/5 of the people were employed with the British. The rest were farmers, a few fishermen, but most of them were unemployed. And we depended on imported food and other staples which we had to get from abroad. And that's why there was a lot of famine, so much so that the bread was so expensive and was so of poor quality that there was a strike in front of the Malta dockyard in May 1970. The Malta also served as a nurse of the Mediterranean, because during the First World War, they brought hundreds, thousands in fact, of sick people and casualties, and they were staged, they were triaged according to their injuries, wounds, and state of health, and they put them in different hospitals which they set up all over Malta. And at that time, there were about 27 hospitals with 25,000 beds available. There was an increase in the garrison force, and of course, the Maltese were involved in this war effort and there was an increase in the dockyard workers. Having said that, in Gozo, things were a bit different. Because of its double insularity, an island within an island, also Gozo was a bit left out by the colonial rulers and also the Maltese authorities at that time. It was a bit marginalized, Gozo, and so it didn't take a direct action in the war effort, and there were only a few ships in the Mjar harbor and some soldiers and sailors at Chambray, but nothing else. On the whole, life in Gozo remained and operated as usual. But in Malta, the civil population had to evolve, had evolving around it. The naval force, garrison forces, prisoners of war, the Malta military, the Malta labor corps, the Malta hospitals, which were filled with foreign soldiers. Of course, there were doctors, Maltese doctors also working in these hospitals. There was the merchant shipping, and Malta also served as a bunkering place where these ships used to get their coal to set sail again to bring cargoes and shipments of armaments and also of food. As we said, the situation in Malta, social situation, was very poor. People were, there were less wheat, less flour, less were being imported. Price of bread increased 3 times. As we said, there was a strike in the dockyard in May 1917, but largely Gozo largely undisturbed by the British interest and maintained normal daily life. But note the drop in the amount of bread and wheat flour at that time. Influenza also health authorities took measures to slow the spread, and even in 100 years ago, they issued instructions to the public in order to educate them and told them what to do to reduce the spread. And some of the measures used, because we know that influenza spreads by saliva from the mouth, sneezing, coughing, people were urged to use handkerchief. They were told not to spit on the floor, street, and anywhere. Washing of the streets was a usual thing. They were advised not to visit sick people and isolate patients who were in ventilated rooms who had symptoms of influenza. They believed that sunlight destroys the virus, and also so sunlight was very, very important. And there was also the general impression that the disease was not severe, but it could have complications, and especially in vulnerable people who were sick with other conditions, chest conditions like tuberculosis at the time, very common, or they had other medical complications. And it can also affect the young, as the old as well. And there were also preventive measures taken for the mitigation of influenza, and this was a circular issued on the 14th September 1918, and it contained certain measures, like all individual levels. They printed out leaflets, posters, showing the nature and spread of the disease. And they also advise the isolation of the sick at home or in a hospital, and not to go to work before they are free from any symptoms, bronchial symptoms, respiratory symptoms, completely. On a public level, the places of gathering were cleaned and kept ventilated and disinfected, in fact. And they used a 5% carbolic solution to clean the streets and the pavements. There was a closure of the schools in October, between October and November. That means during the second wave, which we will see how the waves were distributed throughout the year. And there were also the surveillance of arrivals from abroad and the disinfection of their personal belongings. So they sort of imposed a certain quarantine for people coming from abroad. The closure of the school had a negative effect, which we will explain later. And a curious thing about Gozo is that at that time, people were being buried either in the church or on parvises of the church. And due to this pandemic, there was a regulation which made this illegal. People couldn't be buried anymore in churches or on parvises of churches. And also, there was a curious order by the Bishop of Gozo, which he stopped the tolling and the ringing of church bells during the pandemic, so as not to alarm people who are sick with influenza. You know, when there is somebody dies, there are the tolling of the bells to inform people that somebody died, but the bishop stopped for this, not to alarm people. Measures which were not implicated, well, in hindsight nowadays, which we obviously have been bombarded to use these measures, but 100 years ago in Malta and Gozo, they didn't wear masks, they didn't keep their social distance, and they didn't wash their hands very often. Although masks in other places, I found photos of people in America wearing masks, but unfortunately we didn't have much photos, couldn't find much photos of that period, and we didn't find any people with masks on their face. And they didn't close churches to prevent daily religious activities or special events such as the marriages, baptisms, and other religious activities related to Easter feasts and saints. In fact, I found evidence from the Nadur parish where the Easter sermon, the 3-hour Easter sermon, I found records where they paid the priest who did the Easter sermon of Easter 1919. And also, I saw registers recording payments for the procession of the feast of Saint Coronatus, which is held in November. So it was held in 1918. The feast was also held the same. And in Malta, because in Gozo we didn't have train and tramways, the public transportation continued using trains and tramways. And they also didn't prevent people working with the services from going to their homes. And these, we could see people moving to and fro from the military and the civilian locales without any restrictions. And sleeping special sleeping passes were only cancelled for 2 weeks during the height of the epidemic. It means they prevented them from allowing them from going home only for a couple of weeks, then they could go home without any problems. These are the sources we used. There are the published health reports and the government Gazette. There is the medical reports, which gave an annual report by the medical officer of health, and a very important document, which we only found in Gozo, was the infectious disease registers, the zymotic registers, found in the public health office in Gozo, and their equivalent in Malta, unfortunately, were destroyed. We couldn't find them in the National Archives. We also had a look at the census reports, deaths, births, marriage, and records for Gozo, which we found more information from Gozo archives rather from the Maltese archives. And we got nominative information, but for data production purposes, we avoided giving names, addresses of all these people involved. And as I told you, this was a rare document, which was the register of zymotic infectious diseases in Gozo, because it contained the name of the person, his age, where he lived, the condition for which he was reported, the infectious disease condition for which he was reported, when it was reported, and the outcome of the condition, whether he recovered or whether he died from the condition. Obviously, we covered the certain sensitive data for data protection purposes, but we couldn't get equivalent data from the National Archives regarding Malta. This is a graph which shows the 3 waves of the pandemic. It shows the morbidity, the rate of illnesses between Malta and Gozo during the 3 waves. The first wave was between June and August 1918, and there were 93 cases only in Malta. Gozo didn't experience the harder wave. The second wave occurred from September 1918 to December 1918, and it involved both Malta and Gozo. In Malta, there were reported 13,332, and in Gozo, 2,253 cases. The third wave occurred in winter of 1919, February to May 1919. And there were 4,412 cases in Malta reported, 95 cases only in Gozo. But when we look at the whole 3 waves together, we see that Gozo was overall experienced a higher morbidity than Malta. 10% versus 5.6%. Even though it didn't experience any hard wave, and even though the third wave was a bit muted in Gozo when compared to Malta. But during the second wave, Gozo experienced a heightened wave than Malta. Well, why are the differences in the illness between the 2 islands? Well, obviously, it is the isolation. Gozo is not isolated geographically, an island separated from its mother island, Malta, but also it has got biological isolation and social isolation. Biological isolation because only 1% of people living in Gozo at the time were foreigners or came from abroad. The others were all Gozans. And most of the Gozans even rarely went to Malta. More still, that some of them don't even moved out of their own village and stayed in their own village. So there was this isolation. There is the historical exposure vis-a-vis the previous Russian flu, which we will explain, and also the rurality nature of Gozo. Gozo mainly dependent on villages with people living and working fields. They weren't working with the British services. And so Gozo, even 28 years before the Spanish flu, during the Russian flu in 1889, 1890, they had less exposure from this influenza. They have less exposure. And those, they had that less exposure, and those who were exposed and were babies, there is a theory, a strong theory in the literature, which says that the exposure damaged the immunological system of the babies, so that 28 years later, 30 years later, when they got the Spanish flu, they had a reduced immunity to it, and that's why we got a heightened increase of middle-aged people getting the flu more than the older people, because the older people had some sort of immunity and exposure to it before, during the Russian flu, but not as in Malta. And Gozo was less densely populated and less crowded places, which explains why Gozo did not experience the Herald wave in summer of 1980 and then experienced a heightened wave compared to Malta in the second wave. And a doctor at that time noted that Gozo had less cases because they kept the streets very clean. This was, I got it from the annual medical report of 1819 made by the MHO of the time, Dr. Adriano Cremona. And this slide shows the gender differences, the sex differences in the morbidity rates in Gozo. Because in Gozo, unlike Malta, we got all the data. We didn't have the equivalent data for Malta. Therefore, these slides depict how the disease fared in Gozo. And a striking thing is that children were introduced the disease to the households. And that's why the closure of the schools had a negative effect, because children remained at home, they went playing outside, got into the house, and they infected their parents, they infected their aunts, and they infected their grandparents. And since the mothers and the older sisters remained in the home, meaning they were not working outside their homes, but remained looking after their families, looking after their children, looking after their parents, looking after their husbands. They remained at home, and they got the disease from the children, and they showed a higher morbidity rate than their counterpart males. And this slide emphasizes the children introduce the disease into the households. And also, the reproductively aged female, because they stayed at home, also had the highest morbidity. And again, this slide shows that were more females who got the Spanish flu rather than the males. And the reason is that we believe the males spend more time at home. They were either working in the fields or working outside, and when they had free time, they didn't stay at home. They were in shops and drinking wine or with friends outside. And only the female and the children and the parents and the grandparents stayed at home. So the females got higher rates of infection more than the males. Now this is a graph which shows the influenza, how it infected birds. The annual birth rate around 1914, at the beginning of the First War, dropped. And it seems that births in Malta appear to fall because of influenza, not because of the war. And so there was, both in Malta and Gozo, there doesn't appear to be a baby boom post-war influenza as has been in other European countries. So the increase in births, we cannot see it in Malta and Gozo as we can see it in other places like Germany, England, Wales, and other places. Again, this is the gender difference in the influenza deaths now, and we see that more female died than male, both in the second wave and both in the third wave. And this concept of transportation and influenza has not been studied a lot. And there will be some studies abroad in Malta. We could find some, only very, very few studies in the literature. And so we thought of studying a bit more in Malta. And we could not study it in Gozo, because Gozo there was no means of transport similar to Malta. And at that time, the main means of transport was railway. And people traveled by means of railway from Valletta to Medina, and there were also a number of omnibuses, which were also driven out by horses, and there was the tramway as well, and which was in existence at the time, the carrozzi and foot traffic. But the main means of transport was by means of the trams and the railway. And as we said, information about means of transport during 1918 flu is very sparse. We didn't find much studies. And we found a study in India which had inconclusive results, and another study in Canada which suggests that during a portion of the epidemic, trains were stopped. Malta is the only study that directly addressed the role of trains and influenza, because these means of transport were not stopped, and in fact they were very busy. So the Malta railway line was a single railway line traveling from Valletta to Medina, the only railway on the island, operated from 1883 to 1931, transported both sick to hospitals along the route. So people were exposed. Trains consisted of 10 to 12 carriages, working non-stop, carrying both civilians and military during the First World War. So the exposure was complete, was very obvious. And this is the route of the railway. And so we could divide the population in those who didn't use the train and those who use the train. People who used the train or were living in places on the route of the train were highly exposed. People who were not living near the route of the train or who didn't use the train had a low exposure. And obviously, those who were exposed had a higher rate of infection of influenza. Those who were less exposed had a lower rate of influenza. The death rate didn't vary much, but there was a slight increase also in the death rate for those who were exposed. So in summary, Gozo had complete absence of the summer herald wave. There was a heightened second wave and a significantly lower wave relative to Malta. The influenza death at a significantly younger age than in Malta. The double insularity of Gozo, biological isolation, and the social isolation as well. There was lack of exposure, rurality, and a complex of interrelated risk factors are the primary contributors to the differences in the morbidity experience as we have explained. These factors lie at the core of the differences between Malta and Gozo and explain why the pandemic played out how the pandemic played out in Gozo, which, as you see, was a bit different. The experience was a bit different. Thank you for listening.
Can we go back a little bit? I'd be
Sure.
fascinated to find out how you actually started your research. You're not a researcher, you're a doctor of hyperbaric medicine.
Yes.
How did it all come about?
Well, history and Gozo history is part of my hobbies. I am not an academic researcher or historian, but I happen to be in one of the health office archives, and they had lots of registers thrown about on shelves, picking up dust and so on. And I opened one of them and started reading, and I find it so fascinating that I asked the principal health inspector that we should clean these registers and put them in order. And maybe later on I would have a look at them. And I found most of these data very interesting. So about 5 years ago, I wrote a small article in the Gozo Observer of the University of Malta about the flu pandemic, how it affected Gozo, and in particular Natur, from where I came. I happened to be abroad about 3 years ago, and there was, I received a call. I was in Germany. I received a call from Professor Sucher. He told me he's in Gozo and he wanted to meet me. I told him, unfortunately, I'm in Germany, but in 3 days' time I'm going to Gozo. He said, no worries, I will be in Gozo for 2 or 3 weeks because we are doing a study about the infectious diseases in Gozo, because we study infectious diseases in these islands, Malta, Gibraltar, and of course Gozo. So I would be very happy to meet you because I have read your article in the Gozo Observer, and I think we can expound on that and make a more detailed paper about it. So we met, we made a plan. From my part, I digged into the Gozo archives and the data. They had a look at the National Archives in Malta. They had their analysts in Canada, and there are statisticians. We brought out figures, and we made data, and they put on graphs for us, and we came out with a paper, which was published in the Current Anthropology in February 2018. And the research is ongoing because of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, couldn't come to Malta, but we correspond on a daily basis, and we are studying other aspects of influenza and also other diseases like polio in Malta, and they also wrote a paper about brucellosis in Malta, which was quite a long paper, also published in a book, and hopefully our collaboration and my collaboration with them will continue.
Certainly, following your lecture, it seems so important that we learn from the past, otherwise we are doomed to repeat it. And I was so impressed by the fact that even 100 years ago, the measures which were used were almost the same, except, as you say, for hand washing, masks, and social distancing. I found that quite
Absolutely, because certain basic things remain the same. And we don't know the virus. The virus is there. We only have means to prevent our contact with the virus, and we don't have modern means how to prevent contact with the virus. And nowadays, the three main things to do this is the masks, social distances, and hand washing.
But having said that, you were saying schools closed, and there were a lot of things which
there were also mitigation
there were
measures.
mitigation measures.
There were mitigation measures, like closing the schools, stopping even also gatherings of mass gatherings as well.
But these were not just in Malta. I presume that these measures were taken in other countries.
In other countries as well.
And yet, in spite of that, 14 million people.
Yes, but unfortunately, as we said, the mass gatherings were stopped altogether. For example, festas, Easter, Carnival still happened. But the main spreaders in 100 years ago were the soldiers and the war itself. And this was the main movement of people around because of the war. Because as you know, in other pandemics, only 1 to 2 million people were killed. But in the Spanish pandemic, they quoting 100 million, but it wasn't 100. Let's say 40 million.
But was it that the virus itself was so much stronger that it killed more people?
The virus, we know, it was influenza A subtype H1N1. The Russian flu virus was a virus, a influenza as well, but the subtype we don't know. It could be H3N2 or H3N3. But there is a theory that those babies who were babies in 1889, 1890 and got exposed to it, they had their immunity system damaged because of the virus. Because the virus produced holes in their T cells, and the T cells are the cells which protect our bodies against infections. And when they grew up, they had a damaged immune system. So they were exposed to a virus, even if it was of the same subtype. It was a novel type of virus. It was H1N1. They couldn't cover themselves. They were not immune to it, and so they got sick. And that's why we had this Y-shaped signature, Y-shaped pattern of young people, middle-aged people getting and being killed from influenza. Not only the young and the old and the elderly.
I'm just checking to see if we've got any questions sent to us. But I'm not sure I'm actually getting them, but I'll just carry on and plow on. So, one of the things that bothers me, and I'm sure the people who are obviously living through COVID now would have possibly asked, is does there always have to be a second wave and a third wave? Is that a natural
Unfortunately, it
system?
is a natural. This we knew it many years ago, and from other pandemics before. We are noting it now, because places like China, Germany, so they are getting second waves, and even in Monterey also get a second wave. And so, according to this, in Gozo, this we had very mild spread of the virus, so we are not protected. So, if we get a second wave, my personal view is that we may get it more next time in the second wave.
What actually, in the end, what actually stopped the Spanish flu? Was a vaccine ever found for it?
At that time, no vaccine was found.
No.
Because
so it just died out naturally after.
Vaccines started to be, the smallpox vaccine was around.
Yes.
That's the only vaccine we had. But the influenza vaccine came about after the 1950s.
And yet, in spite of the fact that there was no vaccine, Spanish flu did actually eventually.
It got bored, sort of, and
so just herd immunity.
Herd immunity, natural herd immunity. And in our case, if we don't get the vaccine, it has to be herd immunity, which will protect us next time. So those who were less exposed during this first wave of the present will be more at risk.
So I'm not sure I wanted to hear that, but okay.
Yeah, but it is a fact. And unfortunately, we have to protect the vulnerables again if we get a heightened wave next fall, because they were protected, so they were not exposed, they have less immunity, they need to be protected again, unfortunately. But we can work it out, I am sure, as we did it so well during the first wave.
My final question regards the research and the records in Malta. You said that you found all these registers in Gozo, and obviously even then their true value to history was not fully recognized, let alone to the present. What happened to the Maltese ones? Why did they have
We don't know. We checked at the National Archives, we tried to see whether there are equivalent registers, and unfortunately the answer we got that they were unfortunately destroyed. And as there may have been any more other documents who have been destroyed as well.
What about newspapers and so on? Was there
newspaper narratives? They don't give much. They don't give much as nowadays about it. In fact, we looked at newspapers, although in 1919, I think there were few newspapers, but they didn't mention much of the. They didn't give narratives about the Spanish flu. They mentioned that
compared to now, where we are, I think our generation of us now will regard 1230 as charming couch.
Yes. And the registers we found in Gozo, they were mainly of two types. They were registers of infectious diseases, which has to be kept by law. And they were registers of correspondence of the health office Gozo, where the doctor in charge, which was the medical officer of health, made annual reports and monthly reports to the CGMO of Malta. They were all handwritten, and he commented on the measures taken in Gozo, and there are very, very good narratives. And you can, if you read them, you can see exactly what measures they were taking in Gozo, what cases they had, in which villages, and so on. They were in detail. They were very, very much in detail.
And the other aspect which you brought up in your lecture was the lack of photos. For example, you were saying that you never came across a photo with anybody wearing a mask during the
I never found a photo.
So we should really encourage anybody who may have old biscuit tins of photos and so on,
Yeah.
to really look through them carefully before they throw them away.
We could find a couple of photos of Mondraccio, for example, there is on the slide of the railway. But we also want about photos about the. For example, I couldn't find any photos of ships in Jar Harbor, for example. I found a couple of photos of Chambray with the soldiers in them. But I should have found more photos, for example, about the activities going on in the harbour in Gozo.
Would the services personnel have taken more photos? For example, your field hospital photo in Floriana was extraordinary. I mean, I had no idea that there were 25,000 beds.
In Malta, you get
in field hospitals.
Lots of photos in connection with the services and so on. But in Gozo, there's a lot lack of these photos, and that's our main problem. I am inquiring about certain persons who may have some photos in private collections, but I'm finding it difficult to get these photos. So anybody hearing us about this,
yes,
can
get in touch.
Get in touch, and they will be credited and of course looked after, and given back to them as soon as we make copies of them.
Well, I think we've learned how important it is to understand at least the pandemics that we had in the past, so that we know what to do in the present, let alone in the future. The thought that there will be more viruses coming up in years to come is absolutely terrifying.
It's inevitable. I mean, it's an ecological process. We cannot stop viruses. Mutation of the viruses also, it can be done by man, but it occurs naturally as well. And we have to be very careful when dealing with animals, especially when we keep animals. It happens in other places where these viruses are being created, where in slaughterhouses and places where they cater for animals.
Saliba, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'd like to thank you, of course, for being with us. I'd like to thank the Library of the Central Bank of Malta for organising this as part of their series of lectures. Of course, the Central Bank of Malta for hosting it. We hope we'll be having a lot more of these virtual lectures, even after COVID. Once we open up for people to come here physically to the lectures, I think we've found out a whole new way of, passing these wonderful opportunities on to those who might not be able to be with us at the time. Thank you very much for following us. Please feel free to share the Facebook video, which will be up shortly. And don't forget to accept notifications on the Central Bank of Malta events page so that you know about future events. Like us, follow us, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to our IT staff for sorting out our technical issues, and everyone from the Communications Department for putting this together.
Thank you.